Folded into the corner of the Ashworth Ballroom's gallery, Margaret Hartwell pressed her thumbnail against the seam of her father's last letter and read it for the 11th time. Below her, 300 candles lit a room full of women who had dressed for exactly this occasion, and the chandeliers overhead blazed with the kind of extravagance that required 6 footmen and 4 hours to accomplish. The Countess of Whitmore had arranged her roses in alternating towers of ivory and gold. The orchestra occupied the west alcove, and they had been playing for 40 minutes without anyone listening to them. Silk moved across the floor in patterns as deliberate as anything Margaret had ever seen drawn on paper, and the laughter was precisely pitched, and the jewels were arranged on necks and wrists with the care of someone expecting to be assessed by a panel. It was a room performing its own magnificence, and it was very good at it. And at the edge of all that carefully constructed brilliance, seated in the unlighted gallery, with a folded letter worn soft at its creases, was Margaret Hartwell. She was not hiding. She had simply stopped moving long enough to read the letter again, because her father had been dead for 3 weeks, and she still could not determine whether what he had arranged was an act of love or an act of profound confusion. The letter said, "You are the only person I trust with this, and you are the only person who will understand why it must be him." The man her father meant was Hugo Ashworth, Duke of Stanhope, and Margaret had spent 14 years watching her father refuse to speak his name. She folded the letter with care and tucked it back against her ribs. Below her, the orchestra shifted into a waltz, and the couples arranged themselves with the ease of people who had been practicing at belonging for their entire lives. She watched Hugo Ashworth enter through the south door precisely as she had been told he would, and she noted the way the room adjusted around his presence without appearing to, the slight widening of space, the redirected attention, the sudden recalibration of every young woman within 20 feet. He was taller than she had expected, and dressed with the precision of someone who did not intend to be questioned about anything. He looked across the room, the way she looked across an accounts ledger, taking inventory, noting the discrepancies, moving on. He did not look up to the gallery. She did not expect him to. She was not, at this moment, part of anything he was accounting for. But he would be, she thought. She pressed one hand briefly against the letter through the fabric of her bodice, stood, and descended the service stair. The Hartwell estate had not been a proper estate for a very long time. Margaret had understood this at 16, when her father had handed her the household accounts because Mrs. Norris had left and there was no money to replace her. And Margaret had found in the first column of the first page that the quarterly wool merchant payment had been recorded twice, costing them £11 that they could not afford. She had corrected it without saying anything and returned the accounts to her father, who had accepted them the way he accepted most things she did, with gratitude and without appearing to notice the scale of what had just happened. She was 23 now. The accounts had been hers for 7 years. The letter had arrived on a Tuesday, 3 days after the funeral, delivered by her father's solicitor, Mr. Edmund Vane, who was 71 years old and had the particular expression of a man who expects to be held responsible for news he did not make. He had sat across the morning room table from Margaret and watched her read the letter in full, and then he had cleared his throat and said that there was also a codicil to the will, and the codicil required her to present herself to the Duke of Stanhope within 30 days of her father's death, and to give him a sealed packet of documents that Mr. Vane had been holding for 6 years. "What documents?" Margaret had asked. "I was instructed not to examine them," Mr. Vane had said, "only to keep them." She had looked at him for a moment. "And if the Duke refuses to receive me?" Mr. Vane had unclasped his hands and reclasped them on the table. "The estate's remaining assets, the south field and the timber rights, pass to your cousin Gerald, who has indicated through his own solicitor that he does not intend to keep you on." Margaret had set the letter down and picked up the packet. It was sealed with her father's ring. She had not opened it. She had simply put it with the other things she needed to carry. Her father had not explained why Hugo Ashworth specifically. He had written only, "He is the right man for what I need him to do, and you will see why when you give him the packet. Do not be afraid of him. He is not what I told you he was." Which was, Margaret thought, one of the more disorienting sentences her father had ever produced, given that what he had told her about Hugo Ashworth, from the time she was 9 years old, was that he was a man who could not be trusted with anything that mattered. She had no idea what to do with that revision, so she had set it aside and concentrated on what she could manage. The list of creditors her father had left, the 2 tenant farmers who needed to be reassured, the question of the roof on the eastern wing, and the 30-day window within which she needed to present herself to a duke her father had spent 14 years despising, and now, apparently, trusted completely. She had managed in 7 years the following: the renegotiation of the wool merchant contract from 12% margin to 8%, saving them £43 annually, the correction of 14 errors in the creditor accounts, the arrangement of a new lease for the north pasture after the previous tenant had absconded in November, in which she had identified the clause that would have made them liable for his arrears, and struck it before the solicitor noticed it was there. The decision, in the winter of 1817, to sell 2 of the horses and retain only what was necessary, which her father had grieved, but which had kept them solvent through spring. The management of a household staff of 3, 1 cook, 1 housemaid, 1 groundskeeper, on a budget that required quarterly review and occasional private supplementation from the small income her mother's aunt had left her in a trust her father had forgotten about. She had managed all of this quietly, competently, and without acknowledgement, because that was what the situation required. There was no one to acknowledge her. Her father had been generous, distracted, and increasingly unwell, and he had trusted her the way a drowning man trusts the thing he is holding on to, completely, without examination, because the alternative was going under. There had been one moment, in the autumn of 1816, when a creditor named Hargrove had come to the house and demanded to speak to the man in charge. Margaret had been 21. She had sat him down in the morning room, placed the accounts in front of him, and walked him through every entry for the previous 6 months, including the recovery of the error that had caused the dispute, including the overpayment that Hargrove's own firm had failed to flag, including the adjusted balance that showed that what he believed he was owed was in fact £42 less than the sum he had presented. Hargrove had looked at the accounts for a long time. Then he had looked at her. Then he had asked to speak to her father. "My father is unwell," Margaret had said. "I handle the accounts." She had kept her hands flat on the table and her voice level, and she had not looked away, and eventually Hargrove had accepted the corrected figure and left. She had picked up her list when the door closed and added, "Confirm receipt from Hargrove," to the top and continued. That was not stubbornness. That was not resignation. That was the decision she had made at 16, when she had first understood the shape of what she was managing. She was not going to become less than she was because the situation made it convenient. She was not going to defer to people who had not done the arithmetic. She was going to do what the work required, competently and precisely, and she was going to keep the household standing for as long as it needed to stand. And now the household was gone. Her father was gone, and she had 30 days and a sealed packet, and the strange revised instruction from a dead man who had, apparently, changed his mind about Hugo Ashworth without telling her why. She had one dress appropriate for a society gathering. It was the dress she was wearing now, deep green wool, well cut, 2 seasons old. She had worn it to her father's last solicitor appointment, to 2 church services, and now to the Whitmore ball, where she had obtained an invitation through Mr. Vane's intervention, because it was the only event in the next 14 days at which Hugo Ashworth was confirmed to be in attendance, and she could not afford to wait 14 days. She had also brought the packet. It was in her evening bag, which was the smallest bag she owned and which required her to fold the packet once to make it fit. She had handled it very carefully. Hugo Ashworth had spent the previous 4 months reviewing reports he had no desire to read about an estate he had spent 6 years successfully not thinking about. The reports were thorough. His land steward was a precise man named Aldous Crewe, and they contained information that Hugo would have found useful if he had been capable of receiving it, without the particular cold resistance that settled in his chest whenever the name Stanhope was written at the top of a page. He had inherited the Stanhope dukedom at 26, when his father died with 4 mortgages outstanding and a correspondence trail that suggested he had been aware of their existence for most of Hugo's childhood. Hugo had spent the subsequent 8 years clearing the mortgages one by one, through the kind of deliberate financial management that his father had considered beneath a duke's attention. He had attended to nothing else. He had declined most social invitations. He had not married. He had, until recently, conducted his affairs with the particular efficiency of someone who has decided that human connection is a variable too expensive to maintain. Then, in January of this year, Aldous Crewe had brought him a report that contained a footnote, and the footnote had changed the shape of the thing entirely. The footnote concerned a man named Robert Hartwell, who had died in February and whose estate, a small property in Wiltshire, had gone to his daughter. This was not in itself remarkable. What was remarkable was the note Crewe had appended, that Hartwell had been, for the previous 6 years, in possession of a set of letters that Crewe had been unable to locate in the original Stanhope records, and that the existence of those letters had been confirmed by a former estate secretary who had been paid, apparently, to keep quiet about them. Hugo had read the footnote 3 times. Then he had told Crewe to find out everything he could about Robert Hartwell's estate and his daughter, and to do it quickly. What Crewe had returned with was not what Hugo expected. He had expected a simple property dispute, something his solicitor could resolve with a letter. What he had instead was a report on a young woman who had been managing a failing estate for 7 years with no formal authority and no compensation, and who had, according to Crewe's investigation, prevented the estate's insolvency at least twice through the kind of precise financial intervention that Hugo recognized because he had performed similar interventions himself, at larger scale, with the resources of a dukedom behind him. She had done it with 3 staff members and an accounts ledger. Hugo had held the report for a long time after reading it. Then he had put it in the drawer and gone to the Whitmore ball, because he had accepted the invitation 6 weeks ago, and because he needed to determine whether the daughter of Robert Hartwell was going to appear, as Crewe's second report, delivered 4 days ago, suggested she planned to. He was standing near the fireplace when he became aware of a woman approaching him with the directness of someone who had calculated the most efficient path across a room and was following it. She was not dressed for the occasion in the way that the room was dressed for the occasion. Her gown was green and well made, and it was not new, and she was not wearing jewels, and she was not accompanied by anyone. She was carrying a small bag that she held with the particular care of someone transporting something fragile, and she was looking at him with the expression of a person who has prepared for a conversation and intends to have it. Hugo waited. She stopped at a correct distance, inclined her head precisely enough to acknowledge the courtesy without performing it, and said, "Your Grace, I am Margaret Hartwell. I believe you may have been informed that I intended to find you." "I had been informed," Hugo said. She looked at him steadily. Her eyes were gray and measuring, and she was not attempting to charm him, and she was not frightened of him, and those 2 things in combination were unusual enough to require him to recalibrate his first assessment. "I have something for you," she said, "from my father. I would prefer to give it to you privately if that is acceptable, because I don't know what it contains, and I would rather not find out in a ballroom." Hugo considered the room. The proximity of 3 people he knew would be watching, the angle of the Countess of Whitmore's attention, the particular stillness of Lady Cecilia Darnley, who was standing 15 feet away and who had recently been positioned by her mother as a prospective match for a duke who seemed to be concluding his years of solitude. "The morning room," he said, 30 seconds ahead of me, so this does not become a subject for the Whitmore correspondence. Margaret did not smile. She said, "Yes," and turned and walked toward the corridor at the pace of a woman who has somewhere to be. Hugo remained by the fireplace for precisely 30 seconds and then followed. The morning room was unlighted except for the fire, and Hugo did not call for a candle because the light from the corridor was sufficient and because less light was strategically appropriate. Margaret had placed herself near the window with her evening bag open on the side table, and when he entered and closed the door, she handed him a sealed packet without preamble. He looked at it, his father's ring, his father's seal, broken at some earlier point, and reapplied. He looked at the seal for a moment and then at her. "Did you open this?" he asked. Not accusatory, simply accounting for the facts. "No," she said. "My father's seal was already disturbed when Mr. Vane gave it to me. I believe Mr. Vane did not open it either. I don't know who did." Hugo broke the seal. Inside were 4 letters and a document folded tightly. The letters were in handwriting he recognized after a decade as his mother's. The document was a deed. He read the first letter standing, in the firelight, and Margaret stood across the room and did not speak and did not look at him. She looked at the window instead, and the particular quality of her stillness, not uncomfortable, simply patient, the stillness of a person accustomed to waiting for the results of a process already in motion, was something he noted without intending to. The letter was from his mother to Robert Hartwell. It was dated 1809. It was a letter of gratitude. He read the second letter, then the third. He stood there for approximately 4 minutes and read all 4 letters and the deed, and by the time he had finished, the fire had shifted once, and the music from the ballroom had changed tempo, and Margaret Hartwell had not moved. He folded the letters carefully and held them. "Your father," he said, "lent my mother money in 1809, privately, without documentation except the deed." "I did not know that," Margaret said. She turned from the window. "She was dying," Hugo said. "She wanted to purchase a property, a small one, in Yorkshire, that had belonged to her own mother. My father had declined to purchase it. She had no funds of her own." He stopped. "Your father purchased it on her behalf and held the deed for her until she died. He then retained it." He looked down at the papers. "I have been looking for this deed for 6 years. It should belong to the Stanhope estate, and it was never transferred because she died before the paperwork was completed, and my father did not know it existed, and I could not establish clear title without it." The room was quiet. The fire was the loudest thing in it. "My father despised yours," Margaret said carefully, "because your father refused her. He told me Hugo Ashworth could not be trusted. I think now that he meant the elder Hugo Ashworth." She paused. "He named you specifically in the letter he left me. He said you were the right man for what he needed done." "Why did he wait?" Hugo asked. "I think," Margaret said, "that he intended to approach you himself and ran out of time." She folded her hands. "Mr. Vane told me the estate's remaining assets pass to my cousin Gerald if I do not complete the terms of the codicil. I have done what the codicil required. What you do now is your business." Hugo looked at her for a long moment. She held the look with the composure of someone who does not expect anything in particular from the next 30 seconds, but is prepared for several outcomes. "Miss Hartwell," he said, "I have a steward's report about you." She was quiet for a beat. "I beg your pardon?" "A detailed one, prepared by Aldous Crewe, who is very thorough." Hugo set the letters on the side table. He identified the corrected creditor accounts the North Pasture lease, and the November horses. She looked at him with the particular expression of someone who has just discovered that they were observed, not embarrassed, something more careful than that. Mr. Vane told me, she said after a moment, that I would need to determine what my situation was after the codicil was fulfilled. I had not yet determined it. No, Hugo said. You have 30 days left of the window. You have fulfilled the codicil tonight. He was quiet for a moment. I would like to discuss the Yorkshire property with my solicitor. I would ask that you not make any arrangements regarding your future for the next fortnight. It was not a request, precisely, but it was also not an order. It was somewhere between the two, the kind of statement made by a person who is accustomed to being obeyed, but who has chosen, in this instance, to frame it as something softer. Margaret Hartwell looked at him with the particular expression of a woman who has recognized the distinction and has not decided what to do with it yet. A fortnight, she said, if it is convenient. It is not inconvenient, she said, and picked up her evening bag and left the morning room at the same unhurried, directed pace at which she had arrived. Hugo stood by the side table and listened to her footsteps become inaudible, and then he picked up the 4 letters and read them again. The following fortnight was, in Margaret's experience, the longest 14 days she had managed since the winter of 1817. She returned to the Hartwell house, which was being quietly assessed by her cousin Gerald's solicitor, who had already been through the library, and she set about the last accounting she would do there, the final ledger, the final creditor reconciliation, the letter to the 2 tenant farmers explaining the change in circumstances. She wrote to the cook, to the housemaid, to the groundskeeper, and she arranged references for all 3, which took 2 letters each, and required her to describe their years of service in the precise terms that might induce a new household to take them on. She did not allow herself to think about the fortnight as a period of waiting. She thought about it as a period of completing, and she completed as much as she could reach. On the 10th day, a letter arrived from Hugo Ashworth. It was short. It informed her that the Yorkshire deed had been examined by his family solicitor and was legally sufficient to establish clear title, and that the property, a small farm called Renfield, could now be formally transferred to the Stanhope estate. It informed her that his solicitor had also identified, in reviewing the Hartwell estate's history, a debt owed by his father to Robert Hartwell, not the deed, but a separate informal loan, made in 1811, that had not been repaid. The debt, with interest at a reasonable rate across 14 years, amounted to a figure that Hugo named precisely. He stated that he intended to pay it. The figure was enough to clear Margaret's cousin Gerald's claim on the South Field. She sat with the letter for a long time. She pressed one hand briefly against the tabletop. Then she wrote to Mr. Vane. What she did not write was any expression of the thing that had happened when she read the letter, which was that she had recognized, in the precision of it, the particular grammar of someone who does not perform his intentions but acts on them. The debt could have been paid without being named. The amount could have been approximated. The letter could have been warmer or vaguer or more formal. It was none of those things. It was the letter of a person who had done the arithmetic, found the correct answer, and presented it. She had been reading that kind of letter all her life because she was the person who wrote it. She had not expected to receive one. 3 days later, Hugo Ashworth sent another letter asking whether she would be willing to come to the Stanhope estate in Surrey for a period of 1 month as a guest to review the accounts. He explained, without embellishment, that the estate's wool merchant contract had been revised by his father in 1815, and that there was a clause in the revision that Aldous Crewe believed might be generating a systematic overcharge, and that he would value an independent review. He did not say that he had read her creditor correspondence and identified that she had caught a similar clause in a different context. He did not need to. She accepted within the day, and arrived at Stanhope House 8 days after that. The house was larger than she had been prepared for, not in the way that wealth is usually prepared for, the chandeliers and the receiving halls, but in the operational sense, the scale of what it required to run it, the number of staff, the scope of the accounts, the weight of the estate's history in every corridor. The housekeeper was a woman named Mrs. Garland, who received Margaret with the brisk efficiency of someone who had been told exactly what Margaret's situation was, and had decided, apparently, that the most useful thing she could do was show her where the kitchen accounts were kept. "They're a mess," Mrs. Garland said cheerfully. "Have been since the understeward left in February. Mr. Crewe does his best, but his best is the land accounts, if I'm honest, and the household side has suffered for it." "Show me," Margaret said, and Mrs. Garland took her to the records room, which was a small office off the east corridor that smelled of old paper and had a window that looked onto the kitchen garden. The kitchen accounts were not, in fact, a mess. They were incomplete, which was different. There were 3 months of entries missing from the autumn before last, and there were 2 categories of expenditure, lamp oil and linen, that had been assigned to a general heading rather than itemized, which made it impossible to compare them to prior years. Margaret spent the first 2 days identifying the shape of the problem before she tried to solve it. She requested the missing quartermaster records from Aldous Crewe, who brought them himself and watched her work for 20 minutes without speaking before saying quietly, "You use the same method Mr. Vane taught me." "I taught myself," Margaret said, "from a manual I found in my father's library, but the method is the same." Crewe nodded slowly. He had the expression of someone reassessing a calculation. "The wool merchant clause is on the second shelf, 3rd volume from the left." She found it that afternoon. It was not, as she had expected, a subtle error. It was a compounding clause, buried in a sub-paragraph, that applied a 1% surcharge to any order exceeding a certain weight, and the weight threshold had been set at a level that was crossed in almost every quarter. The clause had been in effect for 8 years. She worked through the figures twice to make sure, and then sat back and looked at what she had. In 8 years, at average quarterly volumes, the overcharge amounted to approximately £320. She did not say this immediately. She wrote it out in a clear table. Year by year, quarter by quarter, the correct figure and the charged figure and the difference, and she annotated it with the relevant clause reference, and she brought it to Hugo Ashworth after dinner, when she had seen that he returned to his study. She knocked. He said, "Come." The study was not what she expected. She had not fully thought about what she expected, but it was not a room with 2 chairs angled toward the fire and a large desk covered in papers that had been organized rather than tidied, which was a meaningful distinction. Organized meant the papers were arranged by purpose, not appearance, which meant the person working at that desk was interested in function over impression. There was a portrait on the far wall that she did not look at directly. Hugo stood when she entered. She set the table on the corner of his desk without preamble and said, "The wool merchant clause, 8 years, £320. He looked at the table. He looked at it carefully, the way she had looked at it, reading the columns in order, following the logic of the annotation. She waited. 312. He said after a moment. She looked back at her figures. He moved the paper slightly and pointed to the 3rd year, 4th quarter. She had applied the standard quarterly weight where she should have used the adjusted weight from that year's agreement amendment. She looked at it for 3 seconds. "You're right," she said. "The amendment is in the 4th volume," he said. "I found it last week. I should have checked all 4 volumes before presenting this." "You had it in 3 days," he said. "Crewe has had it for 2 years. He said it without warmth, as a fact, which was how she received it. There was a chair near the desk, not the one by the fire. He said, "Sit if you'd like," and returned to his own chair, and the room rearranged itself slightly around the fact of both of them being in it. "The merchant can be asked to return the 312, Margaret said, "or a revised agreement can be negotiated that eliminates the clause and establishes a fixed rate, which approach depends on whether you intend to continue the merchant relationship." "I've been undecided," Hugo said. "The wool quality is good." "Then a renegotiation," she said. "I can draft the revised terms if you'd like a starting position." He looked at her then, not the way he had looked at the table, with the measuring attention of arithmetic, but with a different quality, something quieter and more careful. "Yes," he said, "I would like that." She returned to her room and wrote the draft that evening, and she did not think about the way he had looked at her, or not very much. She thought about the clause and the figure, and the most defensible position for a renegotiation, and she wrote 6 pages and went to sleep. She had not expected to feel comfortable in the Stanhope house. She had expected to feel tolerated, or at best employed, or at best useful in the specific way a hired professional is useful, valued for the product, not the person. What she encountered instead was a household that seemed to take its register from its owner, which meant that it was formal without being cold, and that what she did was noticed without being remarked upon, and that when she appeared in the records room at 7 in the morning, Mrs. Garland brought her tea without being asked. Lady Cecilia Darnley arrived on the 4th day. She came with her mother and 2 attendants, and she was precisely as beautiful and precisely as composed as Margaret had expected, because she had seen her at the Whitmore ball from across the room, and she had understood immediately the role she was intended to fill. Lady Cecilia was 24, well-bred, fluent in all the forms of intelligence that aristocratic education produced, and she wore a particular expression when she first encountered Margaret in the corridor, a brief, precise pause, followed by a smile that was impeccably maintained, that told Margaret everything she needed to know about what Lady Cecilia had been told about her presence in the house. "Miss Hartwell," Lady Cecilia said. "How interesting. I had heard the Duke was hosting a professional engagement." She turned the word with the particular care of someone who does not want to leave fingerprints on it. "Reviewing accounts," Margaret said. "Yes. How industrious." Lady Cecilia's smile was entirely real and entirely impenetrable. "I imagine it is useful, having a skill of that kind." Margaret looked at her. Lady Cecilia was the sort of person who understood the weight of the word useful perfectly well, who knew exactly the distance it placed between a skill and a quality, between a service and a person. "I imagine it is," Margaret said, and excused herself and returned to the records room. She picked up her draft of the wool merchant renegotiation and reviewed it. She had been doing this work for 7 years. She was not going to be made to feel that it was less than what it was by a woman who had never had to balance a household account in her life, not from cruelty, but from the simple structural fact that Lady Cecilia had been raised in a world that arranged other people to do it for her. Hugo Ashworth had apparently arranged Lady Cecilia's visit through his solicitor, at his solicitor's suggestion. This was the information Margaret received from Mrs. Garland, obliquely, over tea on the 5th morning, along with the information that Lady Cecilia's mother had been a school friend of the late Duchess, that the expected match had been understood in certain circles for some months, and that Lady Cecilia had arrived with a list of the rooms she intended to redecorate, should the occasion require it. "She showed you the list?" Margaret asked. "She showed Mr. Finch," Mrs. Garland said, which was somehow more specific. Hugo's manner toward Lady Cecilia was, as far as Margaret could observe, exactly what it had been toward everyone in the 3 weeks she had been in the house: courteous, measured, and without particular warmth. He attended the dinner where Lady Cecilia played the pianoforte, and he listened with the particular attentiveness of someone completing a social obligation, and he said the appropriate things afterward, and Margaret watched him from her position near the window where she had been invited to sit by Hugo himself, and she noted that he never once looked at Lady Cecilia the way he looked at a column of figures that had produced an unexpected result. She did not know what to do with that observation. She filed it. The way she filed things she did not yet have a category for. The moment that required her to decide something came on the 7th evening. Hugo had taken to finishing his dinner early and retiring to the study, and on the 7th evening, Margaret was still at the record room desk when she heard him in the corridor. She had been there since 3 in the afternoon because she had found, in the lamp oil entries, what she was fairly certain was a second discrepancy, smaller than the wool merchant clause, but systematic in the same way, which suggested it was not accidental. He knocked on the record room door, which surprised her. "Come in," she said. He looked at the spread of papers on the desk, the lamp oil entries, the annotated comparisons, the draft table she had begun. He did not comment on the hour, which was past 9. "I was going to ask whether you'd found anything else," he said. "Yes," she turned the draft table to face him. "Lamp oil, 2 suppliers, interleaved. The secondary suppliers' rate is 12% above the primaries, and the purchases alternate in a pattern that doesn't correspond to any seasonal variation I can identify. It may be a kickback arrangement. I would need the procurement records to confirm." He looked at the table. Something shifted in his expression. Not surprise, but the acknowledgement of something confirmed. Crew mentioned this possibility last year. He couldn't establish it. He may not have had the secondary supplier's full history. She pulled a second sheet from the stack. "I wrote to my father's wool merchant, the one we used before I renegotiated the contract, and he confirmed that the secondary supplier has a known pattern of this kind of arrangement in smaller households where oversight is minimal." She paused. "I should have asked your permission before writing to him. I apologize." Hugo looked at her with that particular quiet attention that had, over the previous 2 weeks, become something she recognized without being able to fully describe. "Don't apologize," he said. "How long have you known?" 2 days. I wanted to be certain before I said anything. Because you wouldn't present a finding you couldn't defend. It was not a question. "No," she said. "I wouldn't." He pulled the other chair, not the one by the door, the one beside the desk, and sat down, and looked at the papers with the expression of someone prepared to work. "Show me the full pattern," he said. They worked for 2 hours. She showed him the interleaving, and he identified a third period she had not yet reached, and she annotated it, and he found the procurement record she needed in the filing cabinet on the far wall, which he retrieved without hesitation, because he knew where it was, which meant he had been in this room before on a similar errand. At some point, Mrs. Garland brought tea without being summoned and left without comment. At 10:30, Hugo said, "This is enough to terminate the arrangement without penalty under the supply clause." "Yes," Margaret said. "I can draft the termination letter in the morning. I'll have the primary supplier extended before the end of the month." He was quiet for a moment. "You've done more in 3 weeks than Crew managed in 2 years. I'm not saying that against Crew. He is thorough where he has been trained. This is not his training." "It was mine," Margaret said. "I know." He picked up the lamp oil table and looked at it for a moment. Then he said, "My mother used to sit at this desk." She did not look at him immediately. She looked at the papers, giving him a moment. "She managed the household accounts herself," he said. "My father considered it a slight eccentricity. She considered it a necessity." He set the table down. "I have not opened this room regularly since she died." The portrait on the far wall, Margaret realized. She had not looked at it directly. She would have read this the same way, Hugo said, which was not something she knew what to do with. She said after a moment, "The method produces the same result regardless of who applies it. The arithmetic is the same." "That is not what I meant," he said without elaboration. and stood and took the lamp oil table and said good night and left the room. She sat for a moment with the remaining papers. Then she straightened them, gathered her notes, and went to her room. She did not press her hand against the wall. She did not need to. She sat in the chair by the window for a while and thought about the shape of the last 2 hours, the desk, the tea, the way he had said, "I know." And she thought about it the way she thought about everything, completely, without flinching, until she understood what she was dealing with. Then she went to bed. Lady Cecilia departed on the 9th day. She said her goodbyes at breakfast with the perfectly maintained composure of someone who has assessed the room and made a decision based on what she found, and she kissed Hugo's hand in parting and looked at Margaret, once, with an expression that was not hostility but something franker, the look of a person who has lost a competition she had not expected to lose, and who was not going to pretend otherwise to herself, even if she pretended otherwise to the room. Margaret received the look without comment. She was sorry for it, in a quiet way. The system that had arranged Lady Cecilia for Hugo Ashworth was the same system that had arranged for Margaret to spend 7 years invisible, and neither of them had built it. After Lady Cecilia left, Hugo took Margaret to walk the east edge of the estate, which she had not seen, because the east edge was where 3 of the tenant farms were and she had been wanting to understand the agricultural accounts in context. He walked at her pace without appearing to, and he knew the names of the tenant families and told them to her as they passed each farm. And when one of the tenants, an old man named Silas Carver, who had been farming the same field for 40 years, came out of his barn and spoke to Hugo with the easy directness of a long acquaintance, she watched Hugo answer in the same register, not performing condescension, not performing warmth, simply present. On the way back, she said, "How long has Mr. Carver been here?" "Since before I was born," Hugo said. He knew my mother. The wind came in across the fields like weather arriving precisely on schedule, and Margaret turned her face into it for a moment, and Hugo did not say anything. She thought about what her father had written. "He is the right man for what I need him to do." She thought about the letter of gratitude her father had kept for 14 years, the letter from a dying woman to the only man who had helped her in the way that was needed. She thought about what it meant that her father had been that man, and that Hugo had not known it, and that 14 years of misunderstanding had been resolved in a firelit morning room by a sealed packet and 30 seconds of accounting. She thought about what it would mean to stay. The letter from Hugo's father's former solicitor arrived the following week. It was addressed to Hugo and he gave it to Margaret without opening it, which she did not immediately understand until she saw that it was the formal confirmation of the debt repayment, the letter authorizing the transfer of funds to clear Gerald's claim on the South Field. He had given it to her because it was, technically, the resolution of her problem. He had not added anything to it. He did not need to. "Thank you," she said. "Your father lent my mother 18 pounds, Hugo said. "With interest across 14 years, the figure is what I named. The arithmetic is simple." "The arithmetic is never what I'm thanking you for," Margaret said, and he went still, the particular stillness of someone who has received a precise sentence and is taking its measure. It was the private recognition between 2 people who use precision as their primary language. She had told him that she understood the difference between the calculation and the choice. He said nothing for a moment. Then, "I would like to discuss something with you. Regarding the estate, the wool merchant renegotiation drafts are finished," she said. "Not the renegotiation." He was quiet for a second, assembling something. "My land steward is competent. My household management is not, since Mrs. Garland's predecessor died. The procurement problem you found would have continued for another 10 years without outside review. The lamp oil arrangement would have cost me another 200 pounds. He stopped. "I need someone who thinks the way you think, on a permanent basis." She looked at him carefully. "You are describing an estate manager." "I am describing a wife," he said, "who is also an estate manager, or I am attempting to, inexpertly." The room was very quiet. Margaret held the look for 3 seconds, not from composure alone, but from the genuine need to hear the sentence again, internally, to make sure she had received it correctly. "Your Grace," she said, "that is a considerable proposal to deliver between one sentence about your steward and one about lamp oil." "I know," he said. "I had a better version prepared. I seem to have lost it." She looked at him. This man who had read 4 letters from his dead mother in firelight without letting her see his face, who had sat beside her in the record room for 2 hours and said nothing personal until the moment he said something true, who had paid a debt his father owed and done it without making her ask, who had walked the East Fields and said his mother's name without being prompted. "Give me an hour," she said. He looked for a fraction of a second, as though he had not expected that, not a refusal, and not an immediate yes. He said, "Of course," and she went to her room. She sat in the chair by the window for the full hour. She thought about it the way she thought about contracts, reading every clause, every implication, every compounding consequence. She thought about Gerald's claim and the South Field, and what it meant to have no household to return to, and what it meant to have, in the alternative, this one. She thought about the record room, and the desk, and the fact that the window looked onto the kitchen garden. She thought about the letter from her father. "He is the right man." She thought about the lamp oil table and the 312 pounds and the word, inexpertly, and the 4 letters from a woman she had never met who had been thanking a man her father had always been, privately, without anyone knowing. She thought about what it was she was being asked to do, and whether she was capable of it, and what she would be building. At the end of the hour she went back to the study and knocked. "Yes," she said, when he opened the door. He looked at her for a moment, then he said, "I should tell you that I will make a poor subject for the kind of marriage that requires constant emotional performance." "I know," she said. "I have been watching you for 4 weeks. So will I." He extended his hand, not to take hers, but open, an invitation. She put her hand in his. They stood in the doorway of his study for a moment like 2 people who have been solving the same problem from different directions and have just arrived at the same answer. "I should also tell you," she said, "that your cravat has been crooked since this morning." He looked at her. "Since what time this morning?" "Before breakfast," she said. "I noticed at 7. He said, "You have been watching me since 7. "You have been watching me since January," she said. "If Mr. Crew's report was prepared when I think it was." He did not answer that. He raised his hand and she reached up and straightened the cravat herself, efficiently and without ceremony, and he stood still and let her, and neither of them said anything about what that was. The formal announcement of the marriage was made to the assembled county at the Stanhope Midsummer Gathering 6 weeks later, which was not a celebration that Hugo had intended to hold until Margaret had pointed out, reviewing the estate's social obligations, that not holding it would require explanations to the tenant families and 3 of the surrounding landholding households who had been attending for 30 years. He had held it. He had made the announcement himself, standing in the main hall, with Margaret beside him and approximately 90 people in front of him, and he had said it without preamble. "Miss Hartwell and I are to be married. She has agreed, and I intend to deserve it." The room was quiet for a moment in the particular way of rooms receiving information that has been arranged in front of them but that they had not, until this moment, fully assembled. Lord Alderton, Hugo's father's oldest contemporary, a man of 70 who had attended every Stanhope Midsummer for 40 years, and who had, on 3 separate occasions in the preceding weeks, found reasons to mention to Hugo that Miss Hartwell's connections were not what the dukedom required, stood at the far edge of the room with an expression Margaret had seen before. the expression of a man whose arithmetic has produced a result he did not expect, and who is in the process of determining whether to dispute it or accept it. He looked at her. She looked back, not with challenge, and not with concession, but with the steady, measuring attention she applied to everything she was not yet certain of. Lord Alderton inclined his head. It was a small inclination, and it was not warm, and it was not magically converted. It was simply the acknowledgement of a man who has looked at the facts in front of him and found that he cannot dispute them on the grounds he had originally intended. She received it without triumph. It was enough. The climax came in October. Hugo had received, in early September, correspondence from two of the Stanhope estate's principal investors, men who held joint interest in the Renfield property and who had, apparently, been in communication with the former estate secretary who had originally concealed the letters. They claimed that the deed Margaret had delivered was fraudulent, that the seal had been tampered with, which was true, and that the tampering indicated the document's invalidity, which was not. They presented their case in a formal letter to Hugo's solicitor and requested that the matter be referred to a private inquiry panel, and they named themselves as arbiters. Hugo brought the letter to Margaret without comment. She read it and set it down. "They want to hold the inquiry themselves," she said. "Yes. That is not how inquiries work." "No," he said, "but they are counting on the cost of disputing it being sufficient to produce a settlement." She looked at the letter. Then she picked up her pen and said, "When is the solicitor available?" The inquiry was held on a Thursday in October, in a room at the offices of Mr. James Belford, solicitor, who was also the solicitor of the Whitmore family, the Stanhope solicitor, and a man of sufficient standing that his chambers constituted a legitimate neutral venue. Present were Hugo, Margaret, Hugo's solicitor Mr. Phelps, the two investors Mr. Cressington and Mr. Vane, their solicitor, and three witnesses including Edmund Vane, who had traveled from Wiltshire at Margaret's written request, and who arrived with a leather case that he set on the table, with the particular care of someone transporting something important. Margaret had spent 3 weeks preparing. She had, with Mr. Phelps, assembled the following: a full provenance of the seal from Robert Hartwell's personal correspondence, including 6 letters sealed with the same ring across a span of 12 years, demonstrating that the wax impression was consistent and that the disturbance to the seal predated Robert Hartwell's final illness by at least 5 years. A letter from the solicitor who had handled the original property purchase in 1809, confirming the transaction. The 4 letters from the Duchess, which she had kept with Hugo's permission, because they established the entire chain of events, independently of the deed. A table she had compiled herself, cross-referencing the dates and signatures and property records, which was annotated in a hand that was not her most elegant, but was entirely legible and completely sourced. Mr. Cressington opened with the objection about the seal. He was a confident man with a barrister's instinct for establishing a premise quickly, and he established the premise that the seal's disturbance was evidence of forgery, and he cited 2 precedents, and he looked across the table at Margaret and Hugo with the satisfied expression of someone who expects his arithmetic to be uncontested. Margaret set the table of seal comparisons in front of Mr. Belford without standing up. She waited. Mr. Belford read it. She said, "The seal was disturbed in 1815, Mr. Cressington. The purchase was made in 1809. The provenance of both facts is documented in the materials in front of Mr. Belford." She waited again. "The forgery claim requires the document to have been altered after the fact. The Duchess's letters, which are dated and signed, establish the entire transaction independently of the deed. If the deed were forged, the letters would also need to be forged, which would require the forger to have access to the late Duchess's correspondence, her handwriting, and 14 years of undisturbed storage in Mr. Vane's possession." She was quiet for a moment. "Mr. Cressington, is that the argument you intend to make?" The room was quiet, not the theatrical silence of a courtroom confrontation, a more practical quiet, the quiet of men reassessing their arithmetic. Mr. Vane leaned to his solicitor. Mr. Cressington looked at the table. She did not press. She had learned years ago that presenting a finding was different from arguing for it. The finding spoke if it was assembled correctly, and she had assembled it correctly. Edmund Vane opened his leather case and placed the additional correspondence on the table. The letters he had held for 6 years, the original instructions from Robert Hartwell, and the dated receipt that confirmed he had received the sealed packet in 1817, 2 years before Robert Hartwell's death, and 2 years after the seal had been disturbed. The timeline was complete. Mr. Belford read the additional materials with the careful attention of a man who has been practicing law for 30 years, and who knows, when a case is resolved, that it is resolved. He looked up. "Mr. Cressington," he said, "I am unable to find the basis for the fraud claim in the materials presented." Mr. Cressington looked at the table. He looked at the 4 letters in the Duchess's handwriting. He looked across at Margaret with the expression of a man who has not, in his professional life, often been comprehensively out-documented in a quiet room, and who is in the process of understanding what that experience feels like. Hugo, who had been sitting to Margaret's left throughout the entire proceeding without speaking, set his hand flat on the table. Then he stood. He stood and he looked at the room, at Mr. Belford, at the witnesses, at Mr. Vane, at Cressington and Vane, and he said, "Miss Hartwell spent 3 weeks preparing those materials. She did it from the Stanhope Estate Records Room, which she has been reviewing for the past 3 months on behalf of the dukedom. In that time, she identified a compounding overcharge in the wool merchant contract that had cost this estate £312 over 8 years, a procurement irregularity in the lamp oil supply that would have continued to cost it money indefinitely, and the documentary basis for this deed dispute that my own solicitor, with full resources, had not been able to establish." He stopped. "She is the woman I am going to marry. I would ask that her work be received accordingly." The room did not respond immediately. There was a moment, long enough to be meaningful, not long enough to be dramatic, in which everyone in it was recalibrating. Then Mr. Belford said, "The deed is valid. The Renfield property is confirmed to the Stanhope estate." He looked at Cressington. "I believe we are finished." Margaret picked up the annotated table and put it back in her case. She did not look at Hugo immediately. She looked at her materials and made sure they were ordered and complete. Then she looked at him. He was looking at her, not with the measuring attention she had first identified at the Whitmore ball, and not with the quality of someone doing arithmetic, but with something that had no mechanical analog she could identify, something that had been assembled over 4 months from every room they had been in together. She picked up her case and stood, and he extended his arm, and she took it, and they walked out of Mr. Belford's chambers together into the gray October afternoon. She did not say anything for a moment. Then, 312. "What?" "You said 312 in there. You remembered the correct figure." "I always know the correct figure," he said, and she thought she detected something at the edge of his voice. Not quite humor, but the place where humor lived, in a man who had spent most of his life practicing restraint. "It was your finding. I wasn't going to get it wrong." She pressed his arm once, briefly, and did not say anything else. The private proposal came the following Sunday. They had taken to walking the East Fields on Sunday mornings, which had begun as Margaret's habit, and had become Hugo's also, without either of them having arranged it. The Carver family's dog came along because it had twice attached itself to Margaret's skirts, and no one had successfully discouraged it, and Hugo had eventually stopped trying. He waited until they had reached the top of the long field and the Stanhope house was visible in the valley below, and then he stopped and said, I made the formal announcement in June because it was necessary to do it in a room full of witnesses, and it was better to do it plainly. I know, she said. This is not that, he said. I would like to tell you, separately, why. He was quiet for a second. Not because it is convenient, or because you fulfilled a codicil, or because the estate requires someone who can read a ledger. Those things are true, and they are not the reason. He looked at her with the kind of directness that took its time with what it was saying. You spent 7 years doing work that would have been credited to someone else in every other household in England, and you did it because the work needed to be done, and you did not become less than yourself in the doing of it. I recognize that quality because it is the only quality I have ever known how to trust. He paused. I trusted in you. I trust you. That is the reason. Margaret stood on the top of the long field with the wind coming in steady and even, and the dog sitting on her skirts, and the house in the valley, and she thought about it completely and without flinching. I know, she said, and he looked at her, and she said, I mean that I will marry you for the reason you have just named, not the codicil, not the south field, because you came to a records room at 9 in the evening and asked to see the lamp oil pattern, and you stayed for 2 hours, and Mrs. Garland brought tea, and you thanked her by name. She waited a moment, and because you knew the correct figure. He looked at her for a moment longer. Then he said, the dog is on your dress. The dog has been on my dress for 40 minutes, she said, and if I were going to address it, I would have addressed it. He made a sound that was the closest she had yet heard to a laugh. Margaret. Hugo, she said. They were married in December, in the church at the edge of the Stanhope village, with Mr. Vane and Mrs. Garland and Aldous Crewe in the front row, and a woman named Harriet Colville, who had befriended Margaret in the October weeks with the direct, unguarded speed of a person who identifies a kindred mind and refuses to waste time, sitting in the second row and composing herself with imperfect success. Lord Alderton attended. He did not warmly embrace the occasion. He sat in the back and he observed it, and at the reception he approached Margaret without Hugo and said, in the particular tone of a man who is making an acknowledgment he would prefer not to make publicly, you know the estate accounts. Yes, Margaret said, better than Crewe. In some areas, he knows the land better than I do. Alderton looked at her for a moment with the expression of someone completing a calculation. He said and moved away, and that was all. It was enough. Margaret Hartwell, Margaret Ashworth, spent the first year of her marriage completing what she had begun. The wool merchant renegotiation was finalized in February, saving the estate £41 annually. The lamp oil arrangement was terminated, the primary supplier extended, and the resulting savings reinvested in the kitchen garden project that Mrs. Garland had been proposing for 3 years without anyone listening. The household accounts, reorganized into the system Margaret had developed from the Hartwell manual and adapted for the scale of a ducal estate, were used as a model by 2 neighboring households whose stewards asked politely whether they might examine them. She also found time, in the autumn of the first year, to write a formal guide to household accounts management, based on the method, addressed to women who found themselves in charge of such things without having been formally trained for them. She sent copies to Mr. Vane, to Harriet Colville, and to the lending library in the nearest market town. In the 3rd year their daughter was born. They named her Clara, for Hugo's mother. She had Margaret's gray eyes and Hugo's precise attention to any object she had decided was worth examining, and she crawled with the deliberate efficiency of a person who has identified the shortest path from one point to another and intends to follow it. Hugo watched her cross the morning room floor at 11 months with an expression that Margaret had learned, by then, to recognize as his version of open astonishment. He did not know she was watching him, or rather he knew, and had decided it was acceptable. She was sitting in the chair by the window with the quarter accounts open in her lap, and Clara was crossing the floor at her usual determined pace toward the fire screen she had been attempting to reach for a week, and Hugo was standing near the door watching Clara with his arms crossed and something on his face that was entirely uncalculated. Margaret looked at him for a moment. This man who had paid a 14-year-old debt without being asked, who had walked into a records room at 9 in the evening and stayed for 2 hours and thanked Mrs. Garland by name, who had stood up in a room full of witnesses and said, "She is the woman I am going to marry," and meant it to be heard, and she felt, quietly and completely, the settled weight of a life built from the right materials, by the right method, with the right person. Clara reached the fire screen. She patted it. She looked back at her father with the particular expression of someone who has achieved an objective and expects the achievement to be recognized. Hugo unfolded his arms and went and sat on the floor beside his daughter, which was not the behavior of a duke in any tradition that Lord Alderton would have recognized. He retrieved the fire screen before she could pull it over and offered her his watch chain instead, which she accepted with the satisfaction of someone who has negotiated a favorable trade. Margaret watched the two of them for a moment, then set the accounts aside and picked up her pen and added a note at the bottom of the quarterly summary, a figure she had confirmed that morning, the first year's completed savings from the full set of account reforms she had implemented since December of the year before. £437. She wrote it down clearly, the way she wrote everything, precisely, without embellishment, the number exactly what it was, and needing nothing added to it. Hugo looked up from Clara and the watch chain and found her writing, and he watched her the way he always watched her work, with the particular attention of a man who knows he is in the presence of something he values. She did not look up immediately. She finished the notation, confirmed the figure, and then she looked at him across the room, her husband, on the floor, with their daughter and his watch chain, and he looked back at her with the quiet, open, completely unperformed expression of a person who has found, in the place he least expected to look, exactly what he needed. She picked up the quarterly accounts and returned to work, and he went back to Clara, and the morning room was warm, and the house was standing, and everything she had built was precisely what she had intended it to be.